The blood-curdling scream pierced the quiet Montana afternoon as Eleanor Blackwood crashed through the door of her small homestead, her eyes wild with fear. It was 1875, and the promise of a new life on the frontier had turned into a nightmare of abuse at the hands of her husband, Frank Blackwood. 3 years of marriage had transformed him from a charming suitor to a monster who used his fists as freely as his cruel words. Eleanor's pale blue dress was torn at the shoulder, a dark bruise already forming beneath her collarbone. She stumbled toward the wooden table, grasping its edge to steady herself. At 22, her once vibrant spirit had been crushed beneath the weight of Frank's cruelty. Her honey-brown hair fell in disheveled waves around her face, partially concealing the fading yellow bruise near her temple, a reminder of last week's anger. "You think you can hide from me?" Frank's voice boomed as his heavy boots crossed the threshold. His frame filled the doorway, blocking the golden afternoon light. At 35, he was a formidable man, hardened by years of failed mining ventures and a growing dependence on whiskey. A wife doesn't walk away when her husband is speaking. Eleanor backed away, her hands raised defensively. "Please, Frank. I just needed a moment." "You'll have plenty of moments to yourself when I'm done with you." He advanced, unbuckling his belt with practiced efficiency. "Maybe this time you'll learn your lesson." The belt whistled through the air, and Eleanor flinched, closing her eyes against the inevitable pain. But the blow never came. Instead, the sound of boots on the porch interrupted the terrible moment. "Blackwood!" A deep voice called from outside. "Got a message for you from town." Frank hesitated, the belt still clutched in his hand. "Wait right here," he growled at Eleanor. "We're not finished." He turned and strode out onto the porch, slamming the door behind him. Eleanor's breath came in short gasps as she frantically gathered her thoughts. 3 years of this hell was enough. She couldn't endure another day. With shaking hands, she grabbed a small cloth bag from beneath a loose floorboard, quickly filling it with what few precious items she owned: her mother's silver locket, a small pouch containing the money she'd secretly saved from selling eggs, and a faded photograph of her parents. Frank's voice drifted through the thin walls, his conversation with the messenger growing heated. Eleanor knew she had minutes at most. Slipping through the back door, she hurried toward the small stable where their only horse, a gentle mare named Willow, was kept. "Going somewhere, Eleanor?" Frank's voice froze her in her tracks. She turned slowly to find him standing there, his eyes narrowed with dangerous anger. The messenger was nowhere to be seen. "I was just checking on Willow," she lied, clutching her small bag tightly against her side. "With your valuables?" He stepped closer, his hand shooting out to grip her arm with bruising force. "You ungrateful woman. After everything I've done for you." "Please, Frank," Eleanor whispered, trying to pull away. "You're hurting me." "I haven't even started," he hissed, raising his hand. Eleanor closed her eyes, bracing for the blow that would surely come when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the tree line that bordered their small homestead. The stranger rode with easy confidence, his black hat pulled low over his face. As he drew closer, Eleanor could make out broad shoulders beneath a worn leather vest and the glint of a star pinned to his chest. "Afternoon," the rider called, his deep voice carrying easily across the yard. "Hope I'm not interrupting." Frank's grip on Eleanor's arm loosened slightly, but he didn't release her. "Just having a private conversation with my wife, Marshal. Nothing that concerns the law." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to the hitching post. Up close, Eleanor could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with piercing blue eyes that missed nothing as they took in the scene before him. "Marshal Xavier Holden," he introduced himself, tipping his hat slightly. His gaze lingered on Eleanor's bruised face, then dropped to where Frank's fingers still dug into her arm. "And I make it my business to concern myself with all manner of things, Mr. Blackwood." We don't need any help here, Frank insisted, though his tone had shifted to something more cautious. Marshal Holden stepped closer, his movements unhurried but purposeful. Madam, are you all right? Before Eleanor could respond, Frank answered for her. My wife is fine, just had a bit of a fall earlier. Clumsy thing. The marshal's eyes never left Eleanor's face. I'd like to hear that from the lady herself if you don't mind. A tense silence stretched between them. Eleanor felt Frank's fingers tighten in warning, but something in the marshal's steady gaze gave her courage. She began, her voice barely audible. She's fine, Frank interrupted, pulling her roughly against his side in a mockery of affection. Aren't you, dear? The marshal's hand moved casually to rest on his holstered pistol. Mr. Blackwood, I'd suggest you unhand your wife. Now. This is my property, Marshal, and she's my wife. Frank's voice had turned dangerous. The law gives me the right. The law gives you no right to harm another person, Marshal Holden cut in, his voice hard as steel despite its quiet delivery. Now, I won't ask again. For a moment, Eleanor thought Frank would defy the lawman. His fingers dug deeper into her arm, and she could feel the tension vibrating through him. Then, abruptly, he released her with a small shove. You're overstepping, Marshal, Frank warned, his eyes narrowed. Perhaps. The marshal nodded slightly. But I've got a warrant here for your arrest on charges of theft and assault down in Billings. Seems you left some unfinished business there before settling here. Frank's face drained of color. That's a lie. I've never been to Billings. The witnesses say different. Marshal Holden withdrew a folded paper from his vest pocket. I'll need you to come with me, Mr. Blackwood. Eleanor watched as her husband's expression shifted from shock to calculation. His hand twitched toward the knife at his belt. I wouldn't, the marshal said quietly, his hand still resting on his pistol. Frank's gaze darted between the marshal and Eleanor, his breathing heavy. Then, with surprising speed, he lunged toward Eleanor, grabbing her and pulling her against him as a shield, his knife pressed to her throat. Back off, Marshal, he snarled, or my clumsy wife might have another accident. Eleanor stood rigid with fear, the cold metal of the blade pressing against her skin. She could feel Frank's ragged breath against her ear, smell the whiskey that perpetually clung to him. Marshal Holden didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he raised his hand slightly, his expression calm. You're making a mistake, Blackwood. This only ends one way. It ends with you letting me ride out of here, Frank countered, backing toward the stable with Eleanor still held firmly against him. Once I'm clear, I'll let her go. We both know that's not true, the marshal replied evenly. His blue eyes locked with Eleanor's, and in them she saw not pity, but a quiet strength. Madam, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Eleanor gave the slightest nod, careful not to press further against the knife at her throat. Don't talk to her, Frank barked, tightening his grip. Marshal Holden took a careful step forward. The only one who needs to listen is you, Blackwood. You harm that woman, and I'll make sure you never see daylight again. Frank laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. Big words from a man who can't draw without risking her pretty neck. I don't need to draw, the marshal responded, his voice eerily calm. Because you're going to let her go. And why would I do that? Because deep down, you're a coward. And cowards always choose survival. Frank's arm tensed around Eleanor, the knife pressing more firmly against her skin. She felt a warm trickle as the blade nicked her throat. Last chance, Blackwood, Marshal Holden warned, his hand moving slowly toward his pistol. In that moment, Eleanor made her decision. She drove her elbow hard into Frank's stomach, simultaneously dropping her weight to slip beneath the knife. Frank's curse filled the air as she scrambled away, a small line of blood trailing down her neck. The marshal drew his pistol with lightning speed, but Frank was already charging toward him, knife raised. The shot rang out across the yard, and Frank stumbled, clutching his shoulder. The knife fell from his hand as he dropped to his knees, blood seeping between his fingers. "You shot me," he gasped, disbelief evident in his voice. "Be grateful I aimed for your shoulder," Marshal Holden replied, keeping his pistol trained on the wounded man as he approached. With practiced efficiency, he kicked the knife away and pulled Frank's arms behind his back, securing them with handcuffs despite the man's pained protests. Only then did he turn to Eleanor, who stood trembling a few feet away. "Are you hurt, madam?" She raised a hand to her throat, her fingers coming away with a small smear of blood. "It's just a scratch." The marshal nodded, his eyes softening as they met hers. "I'm sorry you had to endure that. No one should live in fear, especially not in their own home." Eleanor glanced at Frank, now slumped against the stable wall, his face contorted with pain and rage. 3 years of terror, and in just moments, this stranger had ended it. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "I take him to Helena to stand trial," Marshal Holden replied, "both for the warrants and for what happened here today." He hesitated, then added, "Do you have somewhere safe to go, Mrs. Blackwood?" The question caught her off guard. In her desperate plan to escape, she hadn't thought beyond getting away from Frank. No, not really." The marshal considered this, his gaze traveling over the small homestead. "There's a decent boarding house in Silver Creek, about 15 miles east of here. The owner, Mrs. Peterson, is a good woman. I can arrange for you to stay there while you decide what comes next." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the suggestion, though anxiety coiled in her stomach at the thought of starting over with nothing. "Thank you, Marshal Holden." "Xavier," he corrected gently, "and it's just doing my job, madam." For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something unfurl within her chest, the faint stirring of hope. "Eleanor?" she offered in return. "My name is Eleanor." Xavier nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Well, Eleanor, let's get you to safety." The journey to Silver Creek took most of the afternoon. Frank had been secured on his own horse, his hands bound to the saddle horn, while Eleanor rode Willow beside the marshal. They traveled mostly in silence, with Frank occasionally cursing or threatening what he would do when he was free again. Each time, Xavier would calmly remind him that such threats only strengthened the case against him. As they rode, Eleanor found herself studying the marshal from the corner of her eye. There was a quiet confidence about him that she found reassuring. Unlike Frank, whose presence always filled her with dread, Xavier's steady demeanor calmed her frayed nerves. "How long have you been a marshal?" she asked, as they crossed a shallow stream, breaking the lengthy silence between them. 5 years now," he replied, adjusting his hat against the late afternoon sun. "Joined up after the war." "You fought in the war between the states?" He nodded, his expression growing distant. "With the Union. Was just a boy when I enlisted, barely 17. Saw things no one should see." Eleanor considered this. "Is that why you became a marshal? After seeing such violence?" Xavier glanced at her, something like surprise in his blue eyes. "That's rather insightful, madam. Most folks don't make that connection." He adjusted the reins in his hands. "But yes, partly. Figured if I had to live with the memory of such destruction, I might as well put it to use preventing more of the same." They lapsed into silence again as the first buildings of Silver Creek came into view. The town was larger than Eleanor had expected, with a main street lined with various businesses, a general store, a saloon, a small bank, and what appeared to be a doctor's office. "We'll stop at the jail first," Xavier informed her, nodding toward a square building with barred windows. "Then I'll take you to Mrs. Peterson's." The process of securing Frank in a cell was mercifully brief. The local sheriff, a gruff man named Hargrove, took charge of the prisoner while Xavier filled out the necessary paperwork. Frank hurled a final threat at Eleanor as she left the building, but his words seemed to have lost their power over her, falling flat in the late afternoon air. Mrs. Peterson's boarding house sat at the edge of town, a well-maintained two-story building with a wide front porch adorned with rocking chairs and potted geraniums. The woman herself matched her establishment, neat, practical, and welcoming without being overly familiar. "Of course I have room," she assured Xavier after he explained the situation in hushed tones. Her kind eyes settled on Eleanor's bruised face without judgment. "The blue room upstairs is prepared. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, dear." "I've arranged to cover a week's board," Xavier added, pressing some money into Mrs. Peterson's hand despite her protest. "That should give you time to decide what you want to do next." Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. "I don't know how to thank you both." Mrs. Peterson patted her arm gently. "No need for thanks. We look after our own out here." "I'll be heading back to Helena with your husband tomorrow," Xavier informed Eleanor as Mrs. Peterson excused herself to prepare some tea. "The trial might take some time. Would you like me to let you know the outcome?" Eleanor nodded, suddenly fearful at the thought of him leaving. As irrational as it seemed, part of her worried that Frank would somehow escape and find her again. Xavier seemed to read her thoughts. "He won't hurt you again," he promised quietly. "I'll make sure of it." "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, fighting back tears. "For everything." Xavier shifted uncomfortably under her gratitude, as though unused to receiving it. "Just remember what I said, Eleanor. No one deserves to live in fear." His voice softened as he added, "Especially not someone with your courage." Before she could respond, Mrs. Peterson returned with a tray of tea, effectively ending their conversation. Xavier departed shortly after, tipping his hat to both women and promising to stop by in the morning before he left with his prisoner. That night, in the unfamiliar comfort of Mrs. Peterson's blue room, Eleanor lay awake, her mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in years, she could imagine a future not dictated by Frank's moods and fists. The fear still lingered. Would he somehow talk his way out of the charges? Would the law truly protect her? But alongside these worries was a flicker of something she had almost forgotten: freedom. She thought of Xavier, of the quiet strength in his eyes when he promised her safety. There had been something in those blue depths that made her believe him, despite years of learning not to trust men's promises. Tomorrow he would leave, taking Frank to face justice, and she would begin the daunting task of rebuilding her life from the ashes of her marriage. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through lace curtains. Eleanor dressed in her only other dress, a simple brown calico that had seen better days, but at least wasn't torn like the blue one. Mrs. Peterson had kindly offered to mend the blue dress, clucking sympathetically over the torn shoulder. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with Mrs. Peterson respecting Eleanor's need for silence as she picked at her eggs and toast. The older woman had clearly hosted women in similar situations before, offering support without prying questions. "Marshal Holden is a good man," Mrs. Peterson remarked as she cleared away the dishes. "One of the few lawmen out here who treats everyone fairly, regardless of their station." Eleanor nodded, wondering if the woman had noticed her interest in the marshal. "He saved my life yesterday. I don't think Frank would have stopped this time." Mrs. Peterson's expression grew solemn. "Then it's Providence that brought the marshal to your door when he did." She wiped her hands on her apron. "And perhaps Providence that brings you here now. Every ending is also a beginning, my dear." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Peterson opened it to reveal Xavier, his hat in his hands, looking freshly shaven and somewhat less trail-worn than the day before. "Morning, ladies," he greeted them, stepping inside at Mrs. Peterson's invitation. "I hope I'm not interrupting breakfast." "Not at all, Marshal. We've just finished," Mrs. Peterson assured him. Can I offer you some coffee before your journey? That would be mighty kind, thank you. He settled into a chair at the table, his eyes finding Eleanor's. Did you sleep well? Better than I have in years, she admitted, offering him a small smile. It wasn't entirely true her sleep had been fitful, filled with dreams of Frank breaking free and finding her, but the safety of the locked door and Mrs. Peterson's presence down the hall had allowed her to rest more deeply than she had in her own home. Xavier nodded, seemingly pleased with her answer. I wanted to let you know that I've spoken with Sheriff Hargrove. He's agreed to keep Blackwood here until I return from Helena in about a week. I need to gather some witnesses for the trial. Eleanor's heart sank at the news that Frank would remain so close. Is that safe? What if he escapes? The Silver Creek jail is secure, Xavier assured her, and Hargrove is a capable sheriff. But if you'd feel safer elsewhere, I could arrange transport to Helena for you as well. The offer was tempting, but Eleanor shook her head. No, I think I need to stay. Running feels too much like letting him win somehow. A look of respect crossed Xavier's features. That's brave of you. But promise me you'll be careful. Don't go anywhere alone, especially after dark. I promise. Eleanor agreed readily. The thought of wandering alone held no appeal anyway. She had barely begun to process her newfound freedom. Mrs. Peterson returned with coffee for Xavier and refills for herself and Eleanor. Marshal, I was just telling Eleanor that she's welcome to stay here as long as she needs. And I mentioned that Mrs. Garrett at the dress shop is looking for help, if she's interested in earning her keep. Xavier sipped his coffee appreciatively. That's a fine idea. Mrs. Garrett is a fair employer. From what I hear. He turned to Eleanor. Do you sew, Mrs. Blackwood? Yes, quite well actually. My mother taught me, Eleanor replied, warming to the idea of having purposeful work. And please, call me Miss Collins. I'd prefer to use my maiden name now. A small smile touched Xavier's lips. Miss Collins it is then. The three of them discussed practical matters for the next hour: how Eleanor might obtain legal separation from Frank, what possessions she might be able to claim from the homestead, and how she could establish herself in Silver Creek if she chose to stay. Through it all, Xavier was respectful and thorough, treating her questions with seriousness rather than the dismissive attitude she had grown accustomed to from Frank. Finally, Xavier glanced at the clock on Mrs. Peterson's mantel. I should get going if I want to make good progress today. He rose from his chair, settling his hat back on his head. Miss Collins, I'll return as soon as I can with news of the trial preparations. Eleanor stood as well, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. Thank you again, Marshal. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived when you did. Let's not dwell on that, he suggested gently. Better to look forward now. Mrs. Peterson tactfully excused herself to the kitchen, leaving them alone in the small parlor. Marshal Xavier, Eleanor began hesitantly. May I ask you something? Of course. How did you know? That Frank was hurting me? She had been wondering this since yesterday. You didn't seem surprised at all. Xavier's expression darkened slightly. I've seen it before. Too many times. He sighed, his hand tightening on his hat brim. My mother lived with a man like your husband for years after my father died in the war. I was away fighting, couldn't protect her. A muscle worked in his jaw. By the time I came home, she was broken in ways that never healed. I joined the Marshals soon after she passed. Eleanor's heart ached for the pain she saw in his eyes. I'm sorry about your mother. So am I, he replied quietly. Which is why I don't hesitate when I see the signs. No woman deserves to live under a cruel hand. His blue eyes held hers intently. Remember that, Eleanor. Whatever lies he told you, whatever reasons he gave, none of it was your fault. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. How had this man, a virtual stranger, understood what she needed to hear most? I'll try to remember. Xavier nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. I'll see you in about a week then. He hesitated, then added, Take care of yourself, Miss Collins. You too, Marshal, she replied, watching as he walked down the porch steps to where his horse waited. As his figure disappeared down the dusty street, Eleanor felt both a sense of loss and a curious anticipation. One chapter of her life had ended violently, but perhaps another was just beginning. The next week passed in a blur of new experiences for Eleanor. True to Mrs. Peterson's word, Mrs. Garrett at the dress shop was indeed looking for help and hired Eleanor after seeing samples of her fine stitching. The work was pleasant, altering dresses, mending torn garments, and occasionally assisting with creating new pieces for the wealthier ladies of Silver Creek. Eleanor found herself settling into a routine that, while unfamiliar, brought her a sense of peace she had long forgotten. Each morning she breakfasted with Mrs. Peterson before walking the short distance to the dress shop. The work kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, preventing her from dwelling too much on fears of what would happen when Frank eventually stood trial. Mrs. Garrett proved to be a kind employer, if somewhat chatty. By the end of Eleanor's first day, the older woman knew most of her story, though Eleanor had been careful to share only the basic details. To her credit, Mrs. Garrett didn't gossip about Eleanor's circumstances to customers, though she did subtly introduce Eleanor to several of the town's more respectable residents, helping her begin to build connections in her new community. You have a real gift with that needle, Mrs. Garrett remarked on Eleanor's fifth day, examining the detailed embroidery Eleanor had added to a child's baptismal gown. I haven't seen work this fine since Mrs. Abernathy moved back east. Eleanor flushed with pleasure at the compliment. Thank you. My mother was very particular about my stitches, made me redo them until they were perfect. Well, she taught you well, Mrs. Garrett declared, carefully folding the small gown. I was thinking, if you're amenable, we might expand your duties to include some design work. Several of my customers have admired your touch. The offer made Eleanor's heart swell with pride. For years, Frank had criticized her every effort, from her cooking to her cleaning to her appearance. To have her skills acknowledged and valued was a novel experience. I'd like that very much, she accepted, smiling warmly at her employer. As the week progressed, Eleanor found herself watching the road into town whenever she had a free moment, hoping to catch sight of a tall figure on horseback. She told herself it was merely concern about Frank's trial, but in her heart, she knew there was more to her anticipation of Xavier's return. On the seventh day after his departure, Eleanor was arranging a display of ribbons in the shop window when she spotted him riding down the main street. Her heart gave a peculiar leap as she watched him dismount in front of the sheriff's office, his movements as assured and graceful as she remembered. Someone interesting out there? Mrs. Garrett inquired, coming to stand beside Eleanor at the window. Eleanor quickly resumed her work with the ribbons. Marshal Holden has returned. I was just wondering if he brought news about my husband's case. Mrs. Garrett's knowing smile suggested she didn't entirely believe Eleanor's casual tone, but she merely said, Well, I'm sure he'll find you when he has information to share. In the meantime, could you help Mrs. Wilson with her fitting? She's waiting in the back room. The rest of the afternoon crawled by as Eleanor assisted customers and completed her tasks, all while acutely aware that Xavier was somewhere in town. Would he come to find her at the shop? Or would he wait until evening when she returned to the boarding house? Her question was answered just before closing time when the small bell above the shop door jingled and Xavier stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered. He looked tired, with a light layer of trail dust still clinging to his clothes, but his eyes brightened when they landed on Eleanor. Miss Collins, he greeted her, nodding politely to Mrs. Garrett as well. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Marshal, Mrs. Garrett replied before Eleanor could speak. In fact, we were just closing up for the day. Eleanor, why don't you go ahead and leave a bit early? I can finish here. Eleanor shot her employer a grateful look. "Thank you, Mrs. Garrett." Outside in the late afternoon sunlight, Eleanor fell into step beside Xavier as they walked toward the boarding house. For a few moments, neither spoke, content in the comfortable silence between them. "How was your journey?" Eleanor finally asked, glancing up at his profile. "Long," he admitted with a small smile, "but productive. I was able to locate 2 witnesses who will testify about Blackwood's crimes in Billings." He hesitated, then added, "And I've arranged for a lawyer who specializes in cases like yours, a Mr. Daniels from Helena. He'll be arriving next week to discuss your options for legal separation." Eleanor's steps faltered slightly. "A lawyer? But I can't afford—" "It's been taken care of," Xavier interrupted gently. "Consider it an advance from the territorial marshal's office. Protecting citizens is part of our duty." Eleanor suspected this wasn't entirely true, that Xavier had likely arranged payment himself, but she didn't press the issue. "Thank you. That's very kind." They reached the boarding house, and Mrs. Mira Peterson invited them to take tea on the front porch, where a pleasant breeze mitigated the warmth of the late afternoon. Once they were settled with steaming cups, Xavier shared more details about the upcoming trial. "It will be held here in Silver Creek, as the most recent offenses occurred in this jurisdiction," he explained. "Judge Hamilton arrives on his circuit in 2 weeks. Frank will remain in custody until then." Eleanor nodded, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "And what are the chances he'll go free?" Xavier's expression turned serious. "With the witnesses from Billings, plus my testimony about what I witnessed at your homestead, it's unlikely." "The charges are serious, Eleanor. He's facing significant prison time." Relief washed through her, though it was tempered by a lingering fear. "And if he does go free?" "He won't," Xavier stated firmly. "But even in the unlikely event that he's acquitted, I've already spoken with Sheriff Hargrove. We would ensure your safety." Eleanor believed him. Over the past week, she had come to understand that Xavier Holden was a man who kept his promises. "I see you've found employment," Xavier observed, changing the subject to something less heavy. Peterson mentioned you're working at the dress shop. How do you like it?" Eleanor's expression brightened. "Very much. Mrs. Garrett is kind, and the work suits me. She's even talking about letting me design some pieces." "That's wonderful," Xavier replied, genuine pleasure in his voice. "You seem different, more at ease." "I feel different," Eleanor admitted. "Sometimes I still catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Frank. But mostly, I feel like I can breathe again." She looked down at her hands, which no longer trembled constantly as they had in Frank's presence. "It's strange how quickly life can change. For the better, in this case," Xavier noted softly. Eleanor met his gaze, struck by the warmth she found there. "Yes, for the better." They talked until the sun began to set, with Mrs. Peterson occasionally joining their conversation before excusing herself to prepare dinner. Xavier shared stories of his travels across the territory, painting vivid pictures of mountains and plains that Eleanor had never seen despite living in Montana for years. Frank had rarely allowed her to leave their homestead, claiming that a wife's place was in the home. In turn, Eleanor told Xavier about her childhood in Ohio, where her father had been a schoolteacher and her mother had supplemented their income with her sewing skills. She spoke of her journey west as a 19-year-old full of romantic notions about frontier life, and how she had met Frank at a social in a small Nebraska town along the way. "He was so charming then," she recalled, a hint of sadness in her voice. "He promised me adventure and a beautiful home of our own. I was young and impressionable, eager to escape the strictures of Eastern society." She shook her head at her own naivety. "The beatings didn't start until after we were married and settled here. By then, I was isolated, with no family nearby and no money of my own." Xavier's jaw tightened at her words, but his voice remained gentle. You survived, Eleanor. Many wouldn't have maintained their spirit through such trials. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the horizon, Xavier reluctantly rose to his feet. I should let you get to your dinner. I need to check in with Sheriff Hargrove anyway. Eleanor stood as well, suddenly aware of how much she had enjoyed his company. Will I see you again before the trial? Count on it, he assured her with a small smile. I'll be staying in town until the matter is settled. Perhaps you might join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant tomorrow evening, if you're free, that is. The invitation sent a flutter of excitement through Eleanor's chest. I'd like that very much. Xavier's smile widened. Good. I'll call for you at 6 then. As she watched him descend the porch steps, Eleanor felt a curious lightness in her heart. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity and changing emotions for Eleanor. During the days, she worked at the dress shop, finding increasing satisfaction in the creative aspects of the job as Mrs. Garrett gave her more responsibility. In the evenings, she often found herself in Xavier's company, whether sharing meals at the hotel restaurant or simply walking through town as the summer evenings cooled. Their conversations flowed easily, covering everything from books they had read to their hopes for the future. Eleanor discovered that Xavier harbored a dream of eventually settling down on a small ranch, tired of the constant travel his job required. He spoke of it almost apologetically, as though expecting her to find such an ambition inadequate. It sounds perfect, she told him sincerely one evening as they sat on a bench outside the general store, watching the town settle into twilight. After so many years of moving around, putting down roots must seem like the greatest luxury. Xavier looked at her with surprise. Most people expect a lawman to crave adventure. They're disappointed when I admit I'd rather have a quiet piece of land and a few good horses. I think there's more courage in admitting what truly makes you happy than in pretending to want what others expect of you, Eleanor replied, thinking of how she had once tried so desperately to be the perfect wife Frank demanded, even as his definition of perfect constantly shifted. As they spent more time together, Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn to Xavier. It wasn't just gratitude for his rescue, though she remained profoundly thankful for that. Rather, it was his quiet strength, his thoughtfulness, and the respect with which he treated her as a person with valid thoughts and feelings, not as a possession to be controlled. For his part, Xavier seemed equally attracted to Eleanor, though he maintained a careful distance that she appreciated. After years of Frank's suffocating possession, Xavier's respect for her boundaries was a balm to her wounded spirit. He never touched her beyond offering his arm during their walks, and he always ended their evenings with a polite goodbye at Mrs. Peterson's door. Yet Eleanor caught the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, the warmth in his voice when he spoke her name. The possibility of something more developing between them both thrilled and terrified her. Could she trust her judgment again, after being so catastrophically wrong about Frank? Mr. Daniels, the lawyer Xavier had arranged, arrived as promised and spent several hours with Eleanor discussing her options for legal separation. With his help, she filed the necessary paperwork, the first step toward officially ending her marriage to Frank. The lawyer was confident that, given the criminal charges against Frank, the separation would be granted without complication. Even without the criminal case, the evidence of abuse would be sufficient, Mr. Daniels assured her. The courts have become less tolerant of such behavior in recent years, though there's still progress to be made. A day before Judge Hamilton was due to arrive, Xavier came to the dress shop just before closing time, his expression more serious than usual. "May I walk you home?" he asked after greeting both Eleanor and Mrs. Garrett. "Of course," Eleanor agreed, quickly finishing her work and gathering her shawl. Something in Xavier's demeanor made her uneasy. "Is everything all right?" They waited until they were outside before Xavier spoke. Frank is demanding to see you before the trial. Eleanor stopped walking, her heart suddenly pounding. Why? He claims he wants to apologize, Xavier replied, clearly skeptical. I told Sheriff Hargrove you wouldn't be interested, but I wanted to let you know in case Blackwood tries to get a message to you some other way. I don't want to see him, Eleanor said firmly, her voice stronger than she felt. The mere thought of being in Frank's presence again made her stomach churn with anxiety. Xavier nodded, relief evident in his expression. I thought as much, but I didn't want to presume to speak for you. They resumed walking. Eleanor lost in thought. After a moment, she asked, Do you think he's genuinely remorseful? Xavier considered the question carefully. In my experience, men like Blackwood rarely feel true remorse. They regret consequences, not actions. He glanced at her. But only you know your husband, Eleanor. If you believe seeing him would bring you some closure. No, she interrupted, more certain now. You're right. Frank doesn't apologize. He manipulates. Whatever he wants to say to me, it's for his benefit, not mine. They had reached the boarding house and Xavier turned to face her on the porch steps. The trial begins tomorrow at 10. You don't have to attend if you don't want to, but the judge may call you to testify. Eleanor squared her shoulders. I'll be there. I need to see this through. Pride flickered in Xavier's blue eyes. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met, Eleanor Collins. Before she could respond, he had taken her hand and raised it gently to his lips, the briefest touch that nonetheless sent warmth cascading through her. Until tomorrow, he said softly, releasing her hand and stepping back. Eleanor watched him walk away, her hand still tingling from the contact. Despite her anxiety about the upcoming trial, she found herself smiling as she entered the boarding house. The courthouse in Silver Creek was a modest building that also served as the town hall for various civic functions. By 9:30 the next morning, it was filled with curious townspeople eager to witness the trial of Frank Blackwood. News of his arrest and the circumstances surrounding it had spread quickly through the small community, and public opinion had firmly turned against him. Eleanor sat in the front row beside Mrs. Peterson, who had insisted on accompanying her for moral support. Xavier stood near the judge's bench in his capacity as a federal marshal, his posture straight and his expression professional, though his eyes softened briefly when they met Eleanor's. Judge Hamilton entered precisely at 10 o'clock, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The proceedings began with the reading of charges against Frank, who stood sullenly beside his court-appointed lawyer. Eleanor barely recognized her husband. 2 weeks in jail had left him unkempt, his normally meticulously groomed appearance now disheveled. He glared at her when she was called to testify, his eyes burning with a hatred that once would have terrified her. Now, she met his gaze steadily as she swore to tell the truth. Mr. Daniels, who had agreed to assist the prosecutor, guided Eleanor through her testimony with gentle questions that allowed her to recount the abuse she had suffered without forcing her to relive every painful detail. Throughout her testimony, she kept her voice clear and her head high, drawing strength from Xavier's supportive presence nearby. Frank's lawyer attempted to paint Eleanor as a neglectful wife who had provoked her husband's temper, but Judge Hamilton quickly shut down this line of questioning. The court is not interested in whether Mrs. Blackwood burned the evening meal, counselor, the judge said sharply. We are here to determine whether your client violated the law by assaulting his wife and the marshal. When it was Frank's turn to testify, he spun a tale of misunderstanding and exaggeration, claiming that Eleanor had always been high-strung and prone to feminine hysteria. He admitted to disciplining her, but insisted that a husband had the right to maintain order in his household. And the knife you held to her throat? Mr. Daniels asked during cross-examination. Was that also discipline, Mr. Blackwood? Frank's face darkened. She was trying to leave me. A man has a right to protect what's his. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the courtroom at his words. Even his own lawyer winced. Xavier's testimony came last, his account professional and factual. He described arriving at the Blackwood homestead and witnessing Frank's physical aggression toward Eleanor, as well as the subsequent confrontation that had led to Frank's arrest. "In your professional opinion, Marshal Holden," Judge Hamilton asked, "was Mrs. Blackwood in genuine danger from her husband?" "Without a doubt, Your Honor," Xavier replied firmly. "Had I not intervened when I did, I believe Mr. Blackwood would have caused serious harm, possibly even death." The trial concluded by mid-afternoon, with Judge Hamilton retiring to consider his verdict. The wait was brief. Within an hour, the court reconvened to hear his decision. "Franklin James Blackwood," the judge began, his voice stern, "this court finds you guilty of assault, battery, and attempted murder. Your actions represent not only a violation of territorial law, but a betrayal of the sacred trust between husband and wife." He paused, his gaze boring into Frank. "I sentence you to 15 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge." Relief washed over Eleanor in a powerful wave, leaving her lightheaded. 15 years. She would be 37 when Frank was released, plenty of time to build a new life far from his reach. Frank exploded at the sentence, lunging toward the judge's bench with a roar of rage. Sheriff Hargrove and his deputy quickly restrained him, but not before he managed to shout a final threat in Eleanor's direction. "This isn't over. You're still my wife, and I'll find you when I get out." Judge Hamilton banged his gavel. "Add threatening the court to the charges, Sheriff. Mr. Blackwood can serve an additional 6 months for contempt." As Frank was dragged from the courtroom, still shouting obscenities, Eleanor remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It was over. She was truly free. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street. Eleanor stood on the steps, breathing deeply, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Miss Collins?" Xavier's voice came from behind her. "Are you all right?" She turned to face him, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Yes. For the first time in years, I believe I am." Xavier returned her smile, relief evident in his features. "Judge Hamilton also granted your petition for legal separation. Mr. Daniels has the paperwork." He hesitated, then added, "I'm proud of you, Eleanor. Your courage in there today was something to behold." Before she could respond, Mrs. Peterson appeared beside them. "Eleanor, dear, several of us are gathering at the hotel restaurant to celebrate. You simply must join us." The impromptu celebration extended into the evening, with various townspeople stopping by their table to express support for Eleanor and congratulate Xavier on bringing Frank to justice. Throughout the meal, Eleanor was aware of Xavier beside her, his presence a steady comfort amid the well-meaning but sometimes overwhelming attention. As the gathering began to disperse, Xavier leaned closer to Eleanor. "Would you care for some air? It's a beautiful evening." Grateful for the suggestion, Eleanor nodded, excusing herself from Mrs. Peterson and the others. Outside, the night air was cool and fresh, scented with summer blooms from the small gardens that lined the main street. They walked in companionable silence until they reached a small park at the edge of town, where a wooden bench offered a view of the distant mountains, silvered by moonlight. "What will you do now?" Xavier asked as they sat down, a respectful distance between them. "Will you stay in Silver Creek?" Eleanor considered the question. Over the past weeks, she had begun to form connections in the small town, her work at the dress shop, her friendship with Mrs. Peterson, the acquaintances who had gradually become friends. "I think I might," she replied. "I like it here, and Mrs. Garrett has offered me a partnership in the dress shop if I stay." Xavier nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a good town. Growing, but still small enough to know your neighbors." And you? Eleanor asked, suddenly anxious about his answer. Will you be leaving soon, now that the trial is over? Xavier turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious in the moonlight. That depends. On what? On you, he said simply. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Me? Xavier took a deep breath, as though gathering his courage. Eleanor, I know we haven't known each other long, and you've just freed yourself from a difficult marriage. The last thing I want is to pressure you when you're only beginning to reclaim your independence. But? She prompted when he paused. But I find myself thinking about you constantly, he admitted, his voice low and earnest. Your strength, your kindness, the way you've faced adversity with such grace. I've never met anyone like you. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, hope and fear mingling in equal measure. Xavier, You don't need to respond now, he interrupted gently. I just wanted you to know that I've been offered a position as sheriff in a town about 20 miles from here, Willow Creek. It would mean settling in one place, which I've been wanting to do. And it would mean being near you, if you'd consider allowing me to court you properly. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, processing his words. The idea of another relationship so soon after escaping Frank terrified part of her. Yet Xavier was nothing like Frank. He had proven that in countless ways over the past weeks. I'm afraid, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Not of you, but of trusting my own judgment again. I was so wrong about Frank. Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. I know. And I would never rush you, Eleanor. We could start as friends, and see where time takes us. Friends, she repeated, testing the word. Then, gathering her courage, she added, though I must admit, my feelings for you already extend beyond friendship. Xavier. His eyes widened slightly, hope dawning in their blue depths. They do? Eleanor smiled, feeling suddenly shy. Yes, but I would still appreciate moving slowly. As slowly as you need, he promised, his own smile breaking through like sunrise. Hesitantly, he reached for her hand, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he enfolded her fingers in his warm grasp. May I call on you tomorrow? Perhaps we could have a picnic by the creek, if the weather holds. I'd like that, Eleanor replied, marveling at how different his touch felt from Frank's gentle, respectful, asking nothing but offering everything. They sat together in the moonlight for a while longer, hands joined, talking of small things and comfortable silences. When Xavier finally walked her back to the boarding house, he raised her hand to his lips once more in a chaste farewell. Good night, Eleanor Collins, he said softly. Sleep well. Good night, Xavier, she replied, reluctant to see him go despite the propriety of their parting. That night, Eleanor dreamed not of Frank's cruelty, but of blue eyes and gentle hands, of picnics by creeks, and possibilities unfurling like flowers in spring. Over the next month, Xavier courted Eleanor with a patience and consideration that continually surprised and delighted her. True to his word, he never pushed for more than she was ready to give, content with holding her hand during their walks, or occasionally brushing a kiss across her knuckles when they parted. Their picnic by the creek became the first of many outings riding into the hills surrounding Silver Creek, attending the small town's summer festival, even traveling together to Willow Creek, so Xavier could introduce Eleanor to the town that would soon become his new home. Willow Creek was smaller than Silver Creek, but charming in its own way, with a main street lined with cottonwood trees and a sense of community that reminded Eleanor of her childhood town in Ohio. The current sheriff, who was retiring due to advancing age, gave them a tour of the town, proudly pointing out recent improvements like the new schoolhouse and the plans for a proper church building. It's a good place to put down roots, the old sheriff told them, his knowing gaze moving between Xavier and Eleanor. Folks here look after each other. On the ride back to Silver Creek, Eleanor found herself imagining a life in Willow Creek, perhaps opening a dress shop of her own, or partnering with the existing general store to offer tailoring services. The ease with which she could picture herself there, with Xavier, both thrilled and frightened her. "You're quiet," Xavier observed as they rode side by side, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. "Did Willow Creek not appeal to you?" "Quite the opposite," Eleanor replied honestly. "I could see myself being very happy there. That's what frightens me. I think how easily I can imagine a future that seemed impossible just a few months ago." Xavier's expression softened. "We make our own futures, Eleanor, and there's no rush to decide anything. I don't start as sheriff for another month." But as the weeks passed, Eleanor found her hesitation gradually giving way to certainty. Xavier was nothing like Frank. He never raised his voice to her, never attempted to control her decisions or movements, never made her feel less than his equal. Instead, he listened to her ideas with genuine interest, supported her growing confidence at the dress shop, and shared his own thoughts and concerns with an openness that Frank had never shown. More than that, he made her laugh. Frank's humor had always been cutting, aimed at belittling others to make himself feel superior. Xavier's was warm and often self-deprecating, finding joy in the small absurdities of life rather than at someone else's expense. One evening in late August, they sat on Mrs. Peterson's porch swing after returning from dinner at the hotel. The air was beginning to carry the first hints of autumn, and Eleanor had wrapped a light shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "I received a letter from the territorial governor today," Xavier mentioned as they gently rocked back and forth. "He's officially confirmed my appointment as sheriff of Willow Creek, starting the 1st of October. "That's wonderful news," Eleanor said sincerely, squeezing his hand. "You must be excited to finally settle in one place." Xavier nodded, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "I am. But I find myself thinking more about who I'll be settling with than where." He turned to face her, his expression earnest in the fading light. "Eleanor, I know we agreed to move slowly, and I've tried to honor that. But I can't leave for Willow Creek without telling you what's in my heart." Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I started falling in love with you that first day at your homestead, when you showed such courage in the face of danger. Every day since has only deepened those feelings." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming joy. "Xavier, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I just wanted you to know before I leave, and to ask if you might consider coming to Willow Creek, not necessarily right away, but perhaps when you feel ready. Mrs. Miller at the general store mentioned they're looking for someone with sewing skills, and there's a small cottage near the edge of town that would be perfect for—" Eleanor placed her fingers gently against his lips, stopping his nervous flow of words. "Xavier Holden," she said softly, "are you asking me to marry you?" His eyes widened slightly, then crinkled at the corners as he smiled beneath her fingers. Gently, he took her hand away from his mouth, holding it between both of his. "I suppose I am, though I'm making a mess of it. I had a whole speech prepared." Eleanor laughed, joy bubbling up from a place inside her that had been dormant for too long. "I'd like to hear the speech." Xavier's expression grew serious, though his eyes still shone with affection. "Eleanor Collins, you are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You've faced darkness that would break most people, yet you've emerged with your spirit intact, your heart still capable of kindness and joy. I love you more than I thought possible, and I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife. Not because you need my protection or support, you've proven you can stand on your own, but because I believe we could build something beautiful together. He paused, his gaze holding hers. I promise you this. The only touch you'll ever feel from me is love. Tears spilled freely down Eleanor's cheeks now, but they were tears of happiness. The contrast between Xavier's gentle proposal and the way Frank had demanded her hand, presenting it as a favor he was doing for a plain girl with few prospects, could not have been more stark. Yes, she whispered, her voice gaining strength as she repeated, Yes, Xavier, I will marry you. The joy that illuminated his face was answer enough, but his words confirmed it. You've made me the happiest man in Montana Territory, Eleanor Collins. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Xavier leaned forward. When she didn't retreat, he closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss so tender it brought fresh tears to her eyes. His hand came up to cradle her cheek, his touch reverent as he deepened the kiss slightly before pulling back, his eyes searching hers for any sign of discomfort. What he found instead was love, shining bright and clear through happy tears. I love you, Xavier Holden, Eleanor said, the words feeling right and true on her lips. And I can't wait to begin our life together. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Silver Creek's small church. Mrs. Peterson hosted the reception in her boarding house garden, which had been transformed with lanterns and wildflowers for the occasion. The entire town seemed to attend, along with several visitors from Willow Creek who wanted to welcome their new sheriff and his bride. Eleanor wore a dress of pale blue silk that she had designed and created herself, with Mrs. Garrett's blessing and assistance. It was the most beautiful garment she had ever owned, and the pride in Xavier's eyes when he saw her walking down the aisle told her he thought so too. Judge Hamilton, who had returned to Silver Creek for his regular circuit, performed the ceremony. There was a poetic justice in having the same man who had freed her from Frank now join her to Xavier, and Eleanor felt the significance deeply as she spoke her vows. I take you, Xavier James Holden, to be my lawfully wedded husband, she said clearly, her voice steady with certainty. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. Xavier's hands were warm around hers as he repeated similar vows, his blue eyes never leaving her face. When Judge Hamilton pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier's kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. Their first home as a married couple was the small cottage Xavier had mentioned, situated on the edge of Willow Creek with a view of the rolling hills beyond. It was modest but well built, with a front porch perfect for evening conversations and a small garden that Eleanor immediately began planning for the spring. Xavier took to his duties as sheriff with the same dedication and fairness he had shown as a marshal, quickly earning the respect of Willow Creek's residents. Eleanor, meanwhile, formed a partnership with Mrs. Miller at the general store, offering tailoring services and, eventually expanding to sell her own designs as well. Their first child, a daughter they named Lily after Xavier's mother, arrived 11 months after their wedding, bringing new joy to their already happy home. Xavier proved to be as gentle and attentive a father as he was a husband, spending hours rocking Lily to sleep or telling her stories as she grew old enough to understand them. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, James, named for Eleanor's father. By then, Eleanor's tailoring business had grown enough to warrant its own small shop adjacent to the general store, and she balanced motherhood with her work, grateful for the independence and fulfillment both roles brought her. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Eleanor with a gift, the deed to a small ranch just outside of town, the realization of his long-held dream. We don't have to move right away, he told her as they stood on the property, looking out over the gentle slopes dotted with wildflowers. but I thought perhaps in a few years, when the children are older and you're ready for a change, this could be our forever home." Eleanor leaned against him, his arm warm and secure around her waist. "It's perfect, Xavier. I can already see our children running through those fields." He kissed the top of her head, his voice soft with emotion. "You've given me everything I ever wanted, Eleanor. A home, a family, a love I never thought I'd find." Eleanor turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. Still handsome, though now bearing a few more lines around his eyes from years of smiling. "And you've given me the greatest gift of all," she replied. "You showed me what love truly means, not possession or control, but partnership and respect." Xavier's eyes darkened with emotion as he bent to kiss her, his touch as gentle and reverent as it had been on their wedding day. "The only touch you'll ever feel from me is love," he murmured against her lips, repeating the promise he had made years ago. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days we have together." As the sunset painted the Montana sky in hues of gold and pink, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety, but joy. Not just freedom, but love. The girl who had once been struck by cruel hands had become a woman who knew her own worth, surrounded by gentle touches and open hearts. And in Xavier's arms, with their children's laughter echoing from the nearby town, she had found her true home at last.